The day the courtroom listened. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 3A creaked open just past 9 on a Tuesday morning, and already the air inside felt like it had been holding its breath overnight. The benches were filled, reporters with their notepads resting on their knees, curious onlookers who didn't have court that day but came anyway, and a few regulars who liked to watch justice play out like it was theater. The fluorescent lights cast a hard glare against the polished wood floors, and the high ceilings made every shuffle, every cough, every whispered word echo like it was part of the record. Then she entered. A girl, just 16, slim, with box-braided hair pulled back tightly from her face. Her school shoes too clean for a place like this. She walked slowly, deliberately, every step forward pulled from somewhere deep inside her. Her name was Alea Jennings. No lawyer at her side. No parent waiting by the bench. Just her. She didn't look left or right. Maybe she didn't want to. Maybe she couldn't. The murmurs began almost immediately. That's the girl who painted the mural, right? Spray-painted City Hall. No remorse. Look at her, stoic. Judge Harold Whitmore sat above them all, his expression carved from stone. His silver hair, his starched black robe, his reputation for zero tolerance. These were things that made defense attorneys sweat. He glanced up from his paperwork just long enough to make eye contact with Alea, and then back down, as if the sight of her had confirmed everything he needed to know. Alea took her seat at the defense table. Alone. Her hands were folded in her lap, but her knuckles were white. Her shoulders square, but her jaw clenched. Outside, the sun poured through windows. Inside, the storm had already started. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor," he began, voice smooth like a newscaster, suit crisp, tie darker than intent. "This case is not complicated. Miss Jennings, age 16, was caught on surveillance footage spray painting a mural on the west-facing wall of City Hall." He gestured toward her without really looking. She did so in broad daylight. She made no attempt to conceal her identity. And what she painted wasn't mere graffiti. It was a politically charged image, a man's face, hands raised, and beneath it the words, "Do I look threatening to you?" The words landed like bricks in the courtroom. This wasn't random, he went on. This was an act of civil disobedience. And while Miss Jennings might believe herself to be an activist, what she did was illegal. The law doesn't bend for youth, or passion, or purpose. Judge Whitmore removed his glasses and set them down. "So, she's a revolutionary now?" A few chuckles echoed softly through the rows. Not cruel, but amused. He continued, "A child with a spray can and an inflated sense of moral duty." Then he looked at Alea, really looked at her this time. "Miss Jennings, what do you believe you're fighting for?" Alea opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The judge didn't wait. "We've raised a generation that confuses rebellion with righteousness," he said, and leaned back. "And now that confusion stands in my courtroom." Silence fell again, thick and stiff. Then came the moment. Alea stood. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Gasps. Whispers. Judge Whitmore didn't even look up from his notes. "No." One word. Final. But Alea tried again. "I'd like to explain." Whitmore looked at her like she'd just interrupted a funeral. "This is not a classroom," he said. "This is a courtroom." Still, she didn't sit. Not right away. But she eventually lowered herself back into her chair, slowly, folding her voice away like a note you write but never send. That afternoon, in a windowless holding room with one flickering light and a chair that wobbled, Alea sat cross-legged on the floor with papers spread around her. Some were printouts. Others were photocopies, old, frayed, ink faded. Most were case law. All of them were her father's. Miles Jennings had once been a history teacher, a loved one, a passionate one, until he went off script one February and dared to teach beyond the textbook. His students called him brave. The school board called him terminated. At home, he wasn't bitter. He still read to Alea each night. He still said, "Your mind is your shield. Your voice is your sword." He gave her an old book once, a legal textbook. Inside, he wrote, "For the day you need it. And you will." She remembered that now. She remembered being 10, curled beside him on the couch, watching him read Tinker vs. Des Moines aloud like it was a bedtime story. "Students," he said, tapping the line, "do not shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate." She read the same passage now, out loud, whispering it like prayer. Then the door opened. Time to return. Back in the courtroom, Judge Whitmore adjusted his robe, motioned to the prosecutor, and prepared for more of the same. But Alea stood. Again, the judge sighed. "Miss Jennings, you were not given the floor." "I understand, Your Honor," she said. "But if the court is going to decide my future, I believe I have the right to speak for myself." There was something about her voice. Not loud, not shaking, just clear. The judge watched her a long moment. Then, finally, he said, 2 minutes. Alea pulled a folded sheet of paper from her jacket pocket. "I'd like to refer this court to the 1969 case of Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Community School District." The room shifted. Attention focused. In that case, the Supreme Court ruled that students do not, and I quote, "shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate." She paused. If that's true inside a school, it must be true outside one. Even on the steps of City Hall. She turned the page. Highlighted paragraph visible. "My mural wasn't vandalism. It was protest. Just as Mary Beth Tinker's black armband was. And if this court punishes me for it, it doesn't just silence me. It rewrites precedent." Nobody whispered. Nobody moved. Not even Whitmore. Alea stood like she'd grown 6 inches taller. Not defiant. Not dramatic. Just undeniable. In the back row, Elaine Cooper, a journalist who had come to cover what she thought would be a routine vandalism case, lowered her pen and stared. She'd heard that voice before. Years ago, in a college classroom, from a professor named Miles Jennings. Elaine remembered what he once told her. "If they're angry, you're probably saying something worth saying." She slipped out of the courtroom, found the bench under the courthouse tree, opened her laptop, and wrote. "Teenage girl stuns courtroom with Supreme Court defense." By the time the court reconvened, her article had already gone viral. Inside his chambers, Judge Whitmore stared at a printout of the mural photo. A black man's face. Hands raised. The words beneath. "Do I look threatening to you?" At first, it was just paint. Now it was more. He thought of past rulings. Cases he'd brushed off. Women he hadn't believed. Youth he'd dismissed. And then he thought of his father. A police officer. A hard man. Who once said, "Don't let emotion sway your judgment." But maybe that had been the problem. Maybe emotion wasn't the enemy of justice, but its beginning. When Judge Whitmore returned to the bench, the courtroom was silent. He adjusted his glasses, then looked directly at Alea. "I've been a judge for over 2 decades, he began. "I've ruled on theft, on fraud, on broken contracts and broken families. I believed I was impartial. I believed I was fair. But fairness," he paused, "doesn't mean refusing to listen." He picked up the photo of the mural. "Do I look threatening to you?" He read it aloud, then looked back at her. "I dismissed you not because your argument lacked merit, but because I assumed your age, your background, your voice couldn't possibly carry the weight of truth." He swallowed. "I was wrong." Gasps. A few tears. Elaine in the back, no longer a reporter, just a witness. "This court," the judge said, "rules in favor of the defendant. All charges against Alea Jennings are hereby dismissed." He struck the gavel, and then, softly, added, "The mural shall remain." And just like that, justice wasn't a theory anymore. It was real. It was living. And it had a name. Alea Jennings. When she walked out of the courthouse, no handcuffs, no bowed head, just wind in her hair and the sunlight at her back, she saw him. Miles Jennings. Arms open. Book tucked beneath one elbow. Eyes wet. He didn't speak at first. Then he whispered, "You did it. You made them stop. You made them listen." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Some truths don't require repetition. Across town, every morning after that, Judge Whitmore took the same walk to chambers. But now he stopped. Every time. Right in front of that mural. Not to judge it, but to remember. To remind himself that truth, when spoken clearly enough, has the power to shift even the oldest stone. And that sometimes justice doesn't need a gavel. Sometimes it just needs a girl brave enough to speak and a man humble enough to hear. As Alea and her father stood under the courthouse steps, a silence still lingered, not one of awkwardness, but of reverence. The cameras didn't flash wildly. The reporters didn't shout. They simply waited. The city was listening. Elaine Cooper stayed back, arms crossed, laptop closed. Her phone buzzed every few seconds. National news desks calling, editorials asking for quotes, advocacy groups asking for a direct line to the girl who reminded the court how to listen. But she didn't answer. Not yet. Some stories need to breathe before they're shared again. Alea looked up at her father. Dad, she said, voice softer now. I wasn't sure they'd hear me. Miles smiled, pride and grief meeting in his eyes. They didn't, not at first. But you made them see you. That's harder. And that's louder. They sat quietly on the courthouse bench for a moment longer, letting the weight of what had happened settle. But neither of them knew that it wasn't over. Inside the city building across the street, Councilwoman Renee Dawkins, a former civil rights attorney and the first Black woman elected to lead the city oversight committee, had watched the ruling on a live stream. She was supposed to be reviewing budget amendments. Instead, she stood frozen in front of her screen, Alea's words still echoing in her chest. She picked up the phone. Get me a session on the calendar, she said to her assistant. We're drafting a resolution. Today. What kind of resolution? A full audit of municipal arrest records for juvenile protest-related charges over the last 5 years. And a motion to create a youth civil rights advisory board. Who chairs it? Dawkins didn't pause. Alea Jennings. If she'll accept. By the next morning, Alea's face was on the cover of 3 major newspapers and trending across social platforms. But what moved people wasn't just the image, it was the headline that accompanied it. The law listened. That afternoon, Alea received an email from the State Bar Association's Youth Initiative Committee. They wanted her to join their public education campaign. A week later, a high school civics teacher in Minnesota assigned his students to read about Alea versus City of Fairborn, not because it was a Supreme Court precedent, but because it was an example of how precedent begins. But none of it compared to what happened 1 week later. Judge Harold Whitmore, stern, known for his detachment, nicknamed the Cold Bench, walked into the annual Judicial Ethics Seminar in Springfield and took the podium for the closing remarks. He'd never accepted speaking invitations before, not once in 23 years. That day, he stood in front of a crowd of fellow judges, prosecutors, and clerks. I presided over a case last week, he began. That reminded me of something I'd forgotten. The room was still. It was a graffiti case. Or at least that's what I thought. A child, a spray can, a message on a wall. But it wasn't graffiti. It was testimony. He looked around slowly. Her name was Alea Jennings. And she reminded me why we wear these robes. Not to rule without question, but to listen, even when the voice is quiet. Especially then. It wasn't a thunderous speech, but it was a seismic shift. By the end of the seminar, a new proposal was circulated, an initiative to require annual racial bias training for all municipal judges. The vote passed unanimously. Across the country, students from Atlanta to Oakland organized mural walks, replicating Alea's original artwork and adding their own. Not acts of defiance, but of remembrance. A living timeline of youth voices no longer willing to be erased. And in the hallway of Whitmore's courthouse, where once hung only portraits of men in dark suits, a new framed photo was added. Alea Jennings standing before the bench, paper in hand, voice mid-sentence. At the bottom, a brass plaque read. She reminded us the law is not finished being written. Alea didn't chase the spotlight after that. She returned to school. She graduated early, got a partial scholarship to a local university, majored in political science with a minor in constitutional law. In her senior year, she gave a TEDx talk, not about her case, not about the courtroom, but about her father, about how he taught her to read between the lines, to see the law not as a weapon or a wall, but as a living document, meant to evolve with the voices of those it serves. The closing lines of her speech were broadcast in classrooms across the country. Justice isn't loud. It's listening. And sometimes, the quietest voice holds the greatest weight, not because it shouts, but because it refuses to back down. In the front row, Miles Jennings stood again. This time, he clapped first. And in the back, seated alone, Judge Harold Whitmore nodded. No robe, no bench, just a man who had once nearly missed the most important testimony of his career. Epilogue. Years later, in a national civics textbook under a chapter titled Modern Youth and Constitutional Speech, a full-page case study is devoted to Alea Jennings. At the bottom, it reads, her voice did not rewrite the Constitution. It reminded us it belongs to everyone, even the ones we're too proud to hear. And in a dusty courthouse office where an old photo still hangs, janitors now stop, just briefly, to read those words beneath the mural. Because truth, once spoken, doesn't fade. It echoes. and Alea Jennings made sure the world would never forget the sound.